The Galactic Empire did not stop because it was satisfied. That is the first lie you have to tear out by the roots if you want the story to make any sense. This was a regime built by a man who looked at a galaxy full of trillions and decided even that was not enough. Palpatine did not think in borders. He did not think in treaties. He did not think in the language of ordinary rulers who conquer until the map looks complete and then sit back to admire their work. He thought in absolutes. Total control. Total submission. Total permanence. And yet, for all the madness of his ambition, for all the machinery of terror he built to make that ambition real, the Galactic Empire never pushed beyond the edge of its own galaxy. It never launched a grand crusade into the black beyond the rim. It never planted its banners in some neighboring spiral of stars. It ruled everything it could touch inside the walls of known space, then stopped as if something in the dark outside those walls had stared back. That should bother you more than the Death Star ever did. Because the Death Star makes sense once you understand Palpatine. Cruelty made sense. Mass surveillance made sense. Planetary occupation made sense. The extermination of the Jedi made sense in the twisted internal logic of a Sith Lord who wanted no rivals left alive. But restraint did not. Not this kind. Not from a man who spent decades lying, murdering, manipulating, and engineering galactic collapse just to place himself on a throne at the center of civilization. A creature like that does not simply decide one galaxy is enough. A man like that does not reach the border of everything known and suddenly become humble. So the real question is not why the Empire was brutal. We already know that answer. The real question is why an empire of that size, with that kind of firepower, with that kind of ruler at its head, looked out into the void and chose not to advance. And the deeper you dig, the worse that answer becomes. To understand why, you first need to understand the size of the thing Palpatine built. People say the Empire ruled the galaxy, but that phrase is almost too small to describe what it actually controlled. This was not a state built on a few major worlds and a powerful navy. This was domination on a scale so absurd the mind starts slipping on it. Roughly 1.5 million member worlds. More than 69 million colonies, dependencies, outposts, and puppet territories spread across the breadth of known space. Not cities. Not provinces. Entire planets. Entire systems. Entire populations living under the shadow of Imperial law, Imperial soldiers, Imperial taxation, Imperial fear. And behind that control stood a military machine so gigantic it almost stops sounding real when you say the numbers out loud. Over 25,000 Imperial-class star destroyers. Not support craft. Not patrol boats. System breakers. Warships so overwhelmingly armed and psychologically dominant that a single one was considered sufficient to subjugate an entire planetary system by itself. One ship to make a world kneel. Now multiply that by 25,000. Then remember those were only the iconic blades at the front of the fist. Behind them came another 1.6 million cruisers, frigates, corvettes, carriers, support vessels, gunships, escorts, and transports, all feeding the same colossal organism. Trillions of personnel. Endless chains of logistics. Entire sectors turned into engines whose only purpose was to keep the Imperial war machine breathing. Then there were the monuments to terror. 2 Death Stars. The first was a battle station 120 kilometers across, requiring more than 1 million military personnel to operate, a weapon built not merely to win wars but to end the idea of resistance through pure psychological annihilation. The second was bigger, deadlier, faster, more refined in its horror. On top of that came superstar destroyers, 19-kilometer command dreadnoughts that could dominate entire fleet engagements by themselves. The Stormtrooper Corps drew from tens of millions of active soldiers, with conscription constantly feeding new bodies into the furnace. Entire worlds existed to train recruits, mine resources, assemble hulls, process fuel, stamp armor, and manufacture obedience. This was not just a military. It was a civilization reorganized around the possibility of war. And that is what makes the pause so terrifying. Because if Palpatine had simply lacked the means to go farther, there would be no mystery. If the Empire had been stretched thin, exhausted, unstable, or too occupied with rebellion to think beyond its own borders, That would be understandable. But that is not what we are looking at. We are looking at the largest centralized war machine in galactic history, built by the most ruthless political predator the galaxy had ever produced, and watching it stop at the threshold of the unknown. Not because it could not imagine more. Because somewhere beyond the edge, more was waiting. And if Palpatine knew that, then everything changes. The Death Stars change. The fleet changes. The obsession with military scale changes. Even the paranoia changes. Because then the Empire starts to look less like a tyrant's final form and more like a barricade built by a monster who had seen something even worse moving through the dark, something that made one galaxy feel less like a kingdom and more like a fortress. If the Empire was a fortress, then the next question becomes obvious. What was on the other side of the wall? The answer begins in a part of the galaxy most people in Star Wars treat like background scenery. A vague label on maps. A convenient place to hide secrets. But to the civilizations that had survived long enough to know better, it was never scenery. It was a warning. On the western edge of known space lay the unknown regions, and the name was not poetic. Exaggeration. It was a confession. This was the part of the galaxy that civilization had failed to tame. That matters more than people realize. Because the Republic had charted hyperspace routes across thousands of years. It had mapped trade corridors through stars, nebulae, black holes, gravity wells, pirate zones, dead systems, and ancient battlegrounds. Whole economies depended on stable navigation. Whole wars had been won or lost on who controlled the safer lane through a dangerous cluster. Civilization in Star Wars was not built only on fleets and worlds. It was built on predictability. Hyperdrives mattered because the galaxy, for the most part, had become legible. People knew where they could go and how fast they could get there. Then the unknown regions began. A vast stretch of space choked with gravitational distortions, unstable hyperspace corridors, rogue celestial bodies, violent solar phenomena, and navigational hazards so unforgiving that standard travel calculations became suicide the moment you crossed too deep. Ships did not just get delayed there. They vanished. Signals disappeared. Tracking beacons died mid-burst. Entire expeditions crossed the threshold and never sent back so much as a final scream. Out in that chaos, the rules civilization depended on simply stopped working. That is why every major galactic power learned the same lesson and learned it hard. Do not go there unless you have a reason strong enough to outweigh the odds of never existing again. The Old Republic avoided it. Ancient Sith powers avoided it. Merchant interests avoided it. Explorers whispered about it, fantasized about it, then mostly died trying to make legends out of themselves inside it. Over centuries, the unknown regions became less a frontier and more a natural border, one so lethal that even the most expansionist civilizations quietly accepted it as final. There were stars beyond it, worlds beyond it, maybe wealth beyond it. But between civilization and those possibilities stood a maze of cosmic violence that did not care how powerful your empire looked on paper. And then there was the detail that turns the whole region from dangerous to nightmarish. The Chiss Ascendancy, one of the only civilizations that actually lived within that hostile expanse, did not fully master it through better computers, stronger engines, or superior charts. They relied, in part, on force-sensitive children with precognitive abilities to navigate routes that machines could not safely predict. Sit with that for a moment. The people born into that region, raised inside it, adapted to its dangers over generations, still needed glimpses of the future to travel it with confidence. That single fact tells you how broken the terrain really was. If the natives needed living intuition to survive, what chance did outsiders have stumbling in blind behind a navicomputer and a prayer? Almost none. And yet Palpatine kept sending people in. That is where curiosity ends and obsession begins. He did not treat the unknown regions like a dead zone to be respected. He treated it like a door that had to be forced open no matter how many bodies broke against it first. Quietly, secretly, over years, he poured resources into expeditions most of his own government never knew existed. Survey teams, recon probes, classified missions, navigators, intelligence assets, specialists thrown into the Western dark with one assignment repeated in different forms. Find a path. Find a passage. Find out what is out there. Many never returned. Some disappeared without trace. Others came back shattered, bringing fragments instead of answers. Isolation broke minds. Bad coordinates killed crews. Gravitational traps folded ships into absence. Still he funded more. Again and again. No hesitation. No mercy. No sign that failure changed anything except the names on the next casualty list. That alone should tell you this was never exploration for glory. Not from Palpatine. Not from a man who measured lives by usefulness and discarded them without blinking. He was not gambling resources on abstract curiosity. He was not chasing romance. He was not trying to plant an Imperial flag on some symbolic frontier because he wanted history to praise his ambition. He was searching with the desperation of someone who already knew the wall was real, already knew something was behind it, and understood that if he could not find a way through first, whatever waited beyond it might eventually find a way in. By the time most of the galaxy realized Palpatine was building an empire, he had already been preparing for something far older than the empire itself. That is the detail that turns this from an interesting military mystery into something genuinely unsettling. Because if Palpatine only started worrying after he seized power, you could dismiss it as Imperial paranoia. A tyrant inventing distant threats to justify a larger fleet. History is full of rulers who did exactly that. But the evidence points somewhere colder than propaganda. It points to a man who had intelligence long before the clone armies marched, long before the Republic burned, long before the Senate applauded itself into irrelevance. As far back as 27 BBY, years before the Clone Wars began, Palpatine already possessed credible information about a hostile force approaching from outside the galaxy. And he buried it. Not because he thought the danger was fake. Not because he needed time to verify it. He buried it because, in his mind, the Republic as it existed could never survive what was coming. It was too divided, too procedural, too slow, too dependent on negotiation and idealism and committees and legal restraints. To Palpatine, all of that was weakness wearing ceremonial robes. If an extragalactic threat ever reached known space, he believed the Republic would die trying to debate how afraid it was allowed to be. So he made a decision so ruthless it feels almost surgical in hindsight. Let the Republic fall first. Then build the only kind of state brutal enough to meet the future. That logic does not redeem him. It makes him worse. Because once you understand that he believed the threat was real, a whole series of monstrous choices start looking horribly coherent. One of the clearest examples came with outbound flight, the deep space expedition carrying 6 Dreadnought-class cruisers and Jedi into the unknown regions. On paper, it was exploration, curiosity, expansion of knowledge. But from Palpatine's perspective, it was an intolerable risk. Too many Jedi. Too far from home. Too close to whatever he believed was moving in the dark. So he secretly maneuvered events toward catastrophe and ensured the mission was destroyed. Every ship. Every life. Gone. But because in his calculation, force-sensitive captives falling into the wrong hands would be catastrophic. He would rather erase his own people than risk letting an external enemy study, exploit, or weaponize them. That is not the decision of a man who merely fears embarrassment. That is the decision of someone preparing for an encounter he thinks civilization is fundamentally unready to survive. And the strangest part is that he almost told the truth. After the Empire formed, Palpatine publicly justified the need for a massive peacetime military by invoking the possibility of invasion from outside the galaxy. Most people treated it exactly the way you would expect. As transparent manipulation. Another manufactured danger to keep credits flowing into warship production and populations too frightened to question where their freedom had gone. And to be fair, coming from Palpatine, cynicism was reasonable. He lied as naturally as other people breathed. The Empire weaponized fear constantly. Why should this have been any different? Because this time, beneath the manipulation, there was a buried core of truth. He did sense something. The records that surfaced later describe a dark presence beyond known space, something malevolent, something approaching, something substantial enough that Palpatine did not leave it in the category of mystical unease. He acted on it. He invested in route mapping operations into the unknown regions. He established hidden infrastructure tied to escape paths and fallback positions. He built contingency into the bones of the Empire itself. Bases like the one on Jakku were not just graveyards of ambition. They were part of a larger design, computers and coordinates arranged around a future emergency exit in case the center of the galaxy collapsed before the threat arrived. And suddenly the scale of his madness begins to shift. The Death Stars stop looking like pure theater. The endless military expansion stops looking merely narcissistic. The crushing economic strain, the obsession with fleet supremacy, the refusal to think small, all of it starts carrying a second shape beneath the first. Yes, he wanted domination. Yes, he wanted obedience. Yes, he was a tyrant in the purest sense. But underneath that cruelty ran a colder current. He was building for impact. Building for siege. Building as if one day the galaxy would face an enemy so alien to its assumptions that all existing systems would fail at once. And the reason that thought should make your stomach tighten is simple. He was right. The species Palpatine feared did not just threaten the galaxy with greater numbers or larger ships. That would have been terrifying enough, but still familiar. Bigger fleets can be answered with bigger fleets. Stronger armor can be broken with stronger guns. History knows how to process those kinds of wars. What made this coming invasion different was that it attacked the very assumptions civilization had built itself on. It did not arrive as another empire with a new flag and a more aggressive navy. It arrived as a category error. They were the Yuuzhan Vong. And the most important thing about them is the one detail that sounds impossible until you understand what it means. The Force did not work on them. Not poorly. Not inconsistently. Not with resistance that a stronger Jedi might overcome. It simply did not apply. The Jedi could not sense them in the way they sensed every living thing around them. They could not reach for them through the currents that had guided galactic warfare for thousands of years. Mind tricks failed. Telekinetic certainty failed. Precognitive advantages broke apart. It was as if an entire civilization had spent millennia relying on a final secret weapon only to discover, in the middle of the worst war in its history, that the weapon had no target. That one fact alone would have been enough to shatter the balance of power. Because the Force was not some decorative spiritual layer sitting politely above galactic politics. It had shaped everything. Dynasties rose and fell around it. Wars were planned around what Jedi or Sith could do in battle. Commanders feared Force users the way older armies feared weapons they could not counter. They were the trump card behind the visible board. Remove that card, and suddenly half the logic of history collapses in your hands. Against the Yuuzhan Vong, it did exactly that. And the Vong were built to exploit collapse. They did not come from some neighboring quadrant or hidden pocket of known space. They came from another galaxy entirely, driven across the intergalactic void after the destruction of their own homeworld through ages of endless war. By the time they reached the borders of Star Wars civilization, they were not explorers. They were not merchants. They were not even raiders in the ordinary sense. They were a migrating engine of conquest with nothing left to lose and no intention of stopping. Worse still, their movement toward the galaxy had not begun recently. Their scouts had been probing the outer edges of known space as early as 3998 BBY. Nearly 4,000 years before Palpatine ever wore a public smile. Think about the scale of that timeline. Civilizations had risen, ruled, fractured, vanished, and turned into myths while the first fingers of this invasion were already reaching inward. Generations had lived entire histories under the illusion of permanence while something beyond the rim moved toward them with religious patience. And everything about that civilization was alien in the most strategically horrifying way possible. The Vong did not rely on conventional machinery. They despised it. Their ships were alive. Their weapons were alive. Their armor was alive. Their infrastructure was grown, not manufactured. Biotechnology was not just a field of study to them. It was the architecture of their entire existence, fused with ritual, pain, adaptation, and doctrine. They did not build factories in the way the Republic or Empire understood factories. They cultivated organisms. They engineered tools out of flesh and instinct. They raised warships like predators and weapons like sacred beasts. That meant the galaxy's standard logic for war started failing before the battles even truly began. No electronic dependence. No familiar production chain. No neat distinction between vessel and creature. Their hatred of mechanical technology ran so deep it had become theology. To the Vong, machinery was not merely inferior. It was profane. Using it was a sin. Living with it was corruption. Civilizations built on droids, navicomputers, reactors, and industrial systems were not just enemies to be defeated. They were spiritual contamination to be purged. And then there was the battlefield adaptation. Their warships possessed organic shielding that could absorb punishment and restructure itself in response to what hit it. The longer conventional weapons engaged a Vong vessel, the more the vessel learned the rhythm of the attack. Fire enough turbo laser salvos at it and the enemy did not simply endure. It evolved against you in real time. Tactics refined over centuries began dying in minutes because the target itself was changing under pressure. That is the kind of enemy that makes commanders feel old all at once. The kind that turns expertise into irrelevance while the battle is still happening. And those ships were only the beginning. The invasion force was not a fleet in the normal sense. It was an armada of world ships, some the size of small moons, each carrying immense populations, soldiers, and the means to reshape planets in the Vong image. They were not coming to punish the galaxy and leave. They were coming to occupy it, rewrite it, and make every habitable world part of a new biological empire. Palpatine saw that shape coming through the dark long before anyone else understood what it meant. And when the Yuuzhan Vong finally arrived, the galaxy learned exactly how expensive disbelief could become. When the Yuuzhan Vong finally entered the galaxy in force, the argument ended. No more theories. No more dismissive laughter at old Imperial warnings. No more safe distance between speculation and consequence. The thing Palpatine had sensed, the thing Thrawn would later fear, the thing the Republic had never truly prepared to face, arrived like a verdict. And within 5 years, the war it unleashed left behind a number so obscene it almost stops functioning as a statistic. 365 trillion dead. That number should not be read quickly. It should not slide past like background narration. It should sit there for a second and refuse to fit inside the mind, because that is exactly what it does. The destruction of Alderaan was one of the great atrocities in galactic memory, 2 billion lives erased in an instant so violently that the event became shorthand for the Empire's evil. The Yuuzhan Vong War consumed 365 trillion sentient beings over 5 years. Not in one flash. Not in one dramatic superweapon discharge. System by system. World by world. Campaign by campaign. A sustained catastrophe so vast that older wars begin to look, not small, but local. And the scale alone still does not capture the horror. Because this was not just a military defeat inflicted on fleets and soldiers. It was civilizational mutilation. Trade routes that had held societies together for generations were shattered. Entire populations were uprooted, cornered, harvested by war, or simply crushed between collapsing governments and advancing biological conquest. Worlds that had supported culture, commerce, memory, and identity for thousands of years were transformed into wastelands or living nightmares. Species vanished forever. Not weakened. Not displaced. Gone. Then Coruscant fell. That is the point where the war stops sounding like a campaign and starts sounding like an apocalypse. Coruscant was not just another major world. It was the beating administrative heart of galactic civilization, the political center of empires and republics, a city-planet containing roughly 1 trillion inhabitants and the accumulated meaning of countless eras. If Coruscant could fall, then nothing in the galaxy was sacred anymore. And when the Vong took it, they did not merely occupy it. They remade it. They reshaped the capital into a grotesque biological reflection of their lost homeworld, turning one of the most iconic symbols of civilization into a living statement that the old galaxy was over. That is the sort of wound history does not close around cleanly. At the Battle of Coruscant alone, Vong numbers surged into the tens of thousands of vessels, And even their own losses there were staggering, with immense portions of their warrior caste dying in the wider invasion. That detail matters because it shows how savage the resistance became once the galaxy finally understood what it was facing. This was not a one-sided massacre carried out against a passive victim. It was total war. Fleets burning themselves out. Governments cracking under pressure. Defenders fighting blind against an enemy their traditions had never prepared them to read. The Vong bled heavily too. They just kept coming anyway. And the old advantages never returned. Luke Skywalker's Jedi Order found itself operating in spiritual darkness. The Force, that ancient axis around which so much of galactic history had turned, offered no familiar clarity against the Vong. No reliable sensing. No easy comprehension. No reassurance that centuries of training could bridge the gap. The New Republic, already strained, began to fracture under the weight of losses, fear, and strategic failure until it collapsed and had to be replaced by the Galactic Federation of Free Alliances just to coordinate survival. Think about what that means. The war was not merely killing people. It was killing institutions faster than they could adapt. By the time the conflict reached its terminal stages, the galaxy that had entered the war barely existed anymore. The final showdown at Ibak 9 and the later climactic struggle at Yuuzhan came soaked in exhaustion, desperation, and numbers so huge they blur into abstraction. Millions of combatants dead in final engagements. Millions more wounded. Entire regions permanently destabilized. Civilian trauma on a scale that would take centuries to metabolize, if it ever could. The war ended, yes, but ended in the same way a body survives a blade by learning how to keep living around the missing piece. And when the smoke finally began to clear, one question remained in every chamber, every command room, every mind still capable of asking it. If this was what happened without the Empire, what would have happened if the Empire had still been there? That question is where the story becomes dangerous, because it forces you into a conclusion nobody wants to touch for too long. Would the Empire have stopped the Yuuzhan Vong? Not the broken remnant limping through the years after Ender. Not scattered admirals clutching fragments of a dead regime. The real Empire. The Empire at full strength. 25,000 star destroyers. 2 operational Death Stars. Sector fleets still intact. Supply lines still flowing. Conscription still feeding bodies into the machine. A Sith Lord at the center who had spent decades building military excess so extreme that everyone around him mistook preparation for madness. Because once you look at Imperial projects through the lens of the Vong invasion, those projects stop looking random. They stop looking like the oversized vanity of a tyrant drunk on fear and symbolism. They begin to align into something colder. Something strategic. Something built for an enemy the rest of the galaxy did not know existed. Start with the Death Star. For years, the common interpretation was simple. It was a terror weapon. A machine built to make rebellion psychologically impossible by proving that no world, no matter how important, was beyond punishment. That interpretation is still true. Alderaan proves it with horrifying clarity. But against the Yuuzhan Vong, the Death Star gains a second meaning that is even more disturbing. A super laser capable of annihilating a planet would also be one of the only weapons in the galaxy with enough overwhelming destructive force to eliminate a Yuuzhan Vong worldship before its organic defenses had time to adapt. Conventional bombardment became less effective the longer it continued. That was the Vong advantage. A Death Star ended the conversation in one shot. Suddenly the obscene scale of the project starts making military sense. The same shift happens with superstar destroyers. In another context, they look like floating monuments to Imperial ego, giant command ships designed as much for intimidation as combat. But against an enemy whose vessels learned under fire, whose invasion required defensive lines anchored by overwhelming command presence and concentrated force projection, those dreadnoughts stop looking theatrical. They start looking like siege breakers. Mobile fortresses built to hold the line while lesser formations died around them buying time. Even Palpatine's cruelties after death begin mutating under that lens. Operation Cinder is one of the most vicious pieces of evidence in the entire Imperial record, a plan to devastate Imperial worlds after Palpatine's fall and punish a galaxy for failing him. On the surface, it is pure spite, the tantrum of a dead tyrant weaponized into policy. And maybe in part it was. But once you place the Vong in the frame, another logic starts crawling underneath it. Burn worlds, strip assets, devastate resource centers, deny an incoming invader the planets and infrastructure it would need to colonize. If the Empire could not survive intact, then leave behind ashes instead of tools. That is not mercy. That is not redemption. It is simply the kind of brutal strategic denial a mind like Palpatine's would consider acceptable if it increased the odds of long-term survival by even a fraction. None of this excuses him. That matters enough to say plainly. Alderaan is still Alderaan. The Jedi Purge is still the Jedi Purge. The enslavement of species, the dismantling of freedom, the normalization of terror, the machinery of oppression that defined the Empire at every level, none of it becomes noble because a worse enemy existed. Palpatine did not become right in a moral sense. He remained monstrous. What changes is not the ethical judgment. What changes is the strategic one. Because the galaxy that mocked him for paranoia later faced the exact type of nightmare his war machine had been grotesquely capable of confronting. And that is where the irony starts to bite. The infrastructure that might have made the difference was gone by the time the invasion arrived. The fleet had been cut apart. The great projects had been destroyed or abandoned. Budgets were slashed. Centralized military authority was gone. The galaxy got its freedom back, and with that freedom came fragmentation, political fatigue, and a desperate eagerness to believe the age of existential war had ended with the Emperor's death. It had not ended. It had only been postponed. And while the New Republic dismantled the machinery it associated with tyranny, one man looked at the wreckage and saw not liberation, but a countdown. He had fought in the places most of the galaxy could not navigate, seen fragments of what waited beyond the border, and understood with chilling clarity that the enemy was still coming. His name was Thrawn. Thrawn understood the problem in a way almost nobody else in the galaxy possibly could, because to him the unknown regions were not a rumor, a map label, or a convenient hiding place for Imperial leftovers. They were home. That matters because everything changes when the dark beyond the border is not theoretical. The average senator in the New Republic could dismiss warnings about extragalactic threats as fearmongering because, to them, peace felt real enough to touch. The Empire had fallen. Palpatine was dead. The Death Star was gone. The old nightmare had burned itself out over Endor. To most of the galaxy, the future looked wounded but manageable. Demilitarize. Breathe. Pretend history had finally exhausted its appetite. But Thrawn came from the Chiss Ascendancy, a civilization shaped by the brutal instability of the unknown regions, and he knew better than anyone how foolish it was to confuse temporary relief with safety. He did not serve the Empire because he loved tyranny. That is what makes him so dangerous and so tragic at the same time. Thrawn was not driven by Palpatine's lust for domination, nor by some romantic attachment to oppression. He was driven by calculation. By pattern recognition. By the cold understanding that when something vast and alien finally crossed into known space, ideology would matter a lot less than whether anyone still possessed the military structure capable of stopping it. And in his judgment, only one structure in the galaxy had ever been large enough, ruthless enough, and coherent enough to survive first contact with a full-scale extragalactic invasion. The Empire. That was the ugly truth sitting beneath everything he did. When Thrawn first came before Palpatine, he did not arrive empty-handed. He brought knowledge shaped by a region where dangers from beyond known space were not abstract campfire stories. He warned directly that there were powers moving outside the galactic border that would eventually find everyone. Not possibilities. Not vague philosophical threats. Actual dangers. Advancing ones. Threats his people had already been contending with in fragmentary ways for generations. Between 3 and 9 ABY, he even encountered a Yuuzhan Vong scouting force and survived. That detail alone should have changed the course of history. The one commander with first-hand contact, the one strategist who knew the enemy was not hypothetical, spent his final years trying to rebuild the only defense he believed the galaxy had left. And almost nobody saw what he was doing. The New Republic looked at him and saw the obvious surface. an Imperial Grand Admiral, a brilliant warlord, a ghost of authoritarianism trying to drag the galaxy back into chains under the excuse of order. And from their perspective, that reading made sense. They had bled to destroy the Empire. They had watched whole worlds suffer under its rule. Why would they interpret the return of one of its greatest commanders as anything but a threat to freedom? Because history does not always wear the right face when it comes back for you. Thrawn was not trying to restore Palpatine's dream out of loyalty to a dead emperor. He was trying to restore capacity, fleets, production, command cohesion, strategic depth. He knew the New Republic was too fractured, too optimistic, too eager to dismantle heavy military power after the trauma of Imperial rule. He knew peace had made them sentimental about preparedness. He knew they were mistaking the absence of immediate catastrophe for evidence that catastrophe was impossible. And he knew, with a precision that should make the blood run cold, that the enemy itself respected what the Empire had once been. Even the Yuuzhan Vong's own scouts recognized that a full-strength empire would have been a far more dangerous obstacle than the weakened, divided order that replaced it. Sit with that for a moment. The approaching invader understood the strategic value of imperial strength better than most of the people living under the freedom bought by its destruction. That is the true tragedy at the center of Thrawn's story. Not simply that he failed, but that he failed in a galaxy incapable of recognizing what he was trying to prevent. He was killed before he could finish rebuilding anything that might have mattered. His enemies celebrated. The New Republic survived another immediate threat. And somewhere beyond the rim, the real storm kept moving, patient as gravity, closing distance while the one mind trying to reconstruct a shield from broken pieces fell silent before the work was done. There was one final reason Palpatine never tried to carry his war beyond the galaxy, and it may be the most revealing detail of all. Even if he had wanted to strike first, the laws of reality would not let him. Hyperdrive travel in Star Wars is not magic, no matter how effortless it sometimes looks on screen. It depends on the structure of space itself, on routes threaded through the gravitational logic of stars, planets, masses, and mapped corridors that ships can calculate and survive. Inside the galaxy, that system made civilization possible. Between galaxies, it became a prison. The intergalactic void did not offer the stable framework conventional hyperspace navigation required. There were no familiar lanes to chart, no trustworthy chain of gravity wells to guide long-range mechanical travel across the emptiness. For all the Empire's power, for all its arrogance, it had reached a border that raw military force could not solve. That is what makes the Yuuzhan Vong so terrifying. They were not bound by the same limitations. They crossed the void using organic propulsion and living systems that functioned where the machinery of the galaxy failed. They arrived from a direction no one could easily pursue and through a barrier no one from inside had ever truly broken. In that sense, the galaxy was never simply unprepared. It was asymmetrically trapped. The civilizations inside it had evolved around one set of physical assumptions. The threat outside it had evolved around another. Palpatine, for all his cruelty, seems to have understood that before almost anyone else. He did not look outward and see fresh territory. He looked outward and saw a wall he could not cross and an enemy that eventually might. That is why every piece of the story locks together in such an ugly way. Palpatine toppled a republic that had stood for 1,000 generations. He exterminated an order of warriors and mystics that had guarded the galaxy for 25,000 years. He turned entire species into subjects, entire worlds into examples, entire economies into fuel for war. This was not a man who accepted limits easily. He did not stop because he became content. He did not stop because he became wise. He stopped because at the galactic edge he found the one thing every tyrant eventually finds and cannot forgive. A boundary that did not care who he was. So he built inward. He built fleets. He built battle stations. He built reserve routes into the unknown regions. He built secret contingency plans. He built a state so militarized, so paranoid, so violently centralized that the rest of the galaxy could only interpret it as the final form of authoritarian excess. And they were not wrong. It was authoritarian excess. It was evil on a scale almost impossible to overstate. But beneath that evil sat a calculation the galaxy did not understand until it was far too late. Palpatine was preparing for a storm that no one else could yet see clearly enough to fear. Then the rebels won. The Emperor died over Endor. The second Death Star was destroyed. The fleet fragmented. Budgets were cut. The war machine that had held the galaxy in terror was dismantled piece by piece, and for the first time in decades, people could breathe without an Imperial boot on their neck. The relief was real. The joy was real. The liberation was real. And it was followed, years later, by the arrival of living moon-sized world ships, force immunity, biological warfare, civilizational collapse, and 365 trillion dead. Exactly the kind of threat Palpatine had feared. Exactly the kind of threat Thrawn had warned about. Exactly the kind of threat a fully operational Imperial military might actually have been capable of meeting. That is the greatest irony in Star Wars, and it is not a comfortable one. The Empire was brutal, oppressive, murderous, and built on suffering. It deserved to fall. But when it fell, the galaxy also tore down the only shield large enough to stand between itself and what was coming from the dark. Freedom won the war everyone could see. Then the future arrived from outside the map and showed everyone the cost of destroying a monster before replacing the wall it had become. And maybe that is why this story lingers. Because it does not ask whether Palpatine was good. He was not. It asks something far more unsettling. What do you do when the worst man in history is right about the shape of the next disaster? What do you do when tyranny and survival become tangled so tightly that history cannot cut them apart cleanly anymore? The galaxy answered that question the hard way. It looked at the shield, hated the hand that built it, tore it down, and only understood what it had lost when the storm finally came through.